Welcome back, everyone, to our Deep Dive series. Today we're tackling Azure Identity, Access, and Security. This is episode 10 in our Mastering Azure Fundamentals run.
That's right. We've got a great collection of information shared with us, focusing on some really critical area.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to break it all down, make it clear how Azure figures out who can access what, and importantly, how it keeps things safe.
We'll touch on everything from cloud directories, authentication methods, defense strategies, the whole shebang.
Trying to keep it clear, not too overwhelming. So where should we kick things off? Maybe Azure Directory Services.
Sounds like the perfect place to start. It's, foundational how identity and access actually get managed in Azure.
Right. And the material points straight at Microsoft Entra ID, doesn't it, as the main cloud directory service?
It does. And it's more than just like a list of users, right? Think of it as the engine powering sign-ins and access, not just for Microsoft stuff, but custom apps too.
Right.
And it even helps manage on-premises Active Directory.
Ah, so it connects those two worlds. Because, many people know the classic on-prem Active Directory, the one organizations run on their own servers.
Exactly. But Entra ID is different. Microsoft manages it. It's global.
It's like the difference between securing your local office versus a worldwide operation, maybe.
That's a good way to put it. And security-wise, hooking up your on-prem AD with Entra ID, that's a big boost.
How so?
Well, the sources mention Microsoft actively watching sign-ins via Entra ID. They look for suspicious stuff, weird locations, new devices, that kind of thing.
And that extra monitoring doesn't cost extra compared to just having on-prem AD alone.
Correct. That's a real benefit noted in the materials, a free layer of enhanced security watching those logins.
Makes sense. So who's actually using Microsoft Entra ID day-to-day? It sounds like it touches a lot of roles.
It really does. The info breaks it down nicely. You've got IT administrators, obviously. They use it for access control, setting policies.
Okay.
Then application developers, they leverage it for things like single sign-on, building identity right into their apps.
Right, so users don't have to log in everywhere.
Exactly. And the users themselves benefit too with self-service stuff like password resets and, anyone using Microsoft 365, Azure, Dynamics, they're using Entra ID every time they log in.
It's this fundamental piece under the hood for so much of the Microsoft cloud. What are the core services it actually provides?
Good question. The material lists a few key ones. Authentication is number one, just verifying you are who you say you are.
The basics.
Right. But with robust features, self-service password reset, MFA, which we'll dig into, more banned password lists, smart lockout against attacks.
Okay, so that's the prove your identity step. What's next?
Well, once you're in, you often need access to lots of different apps. That's where single sign-on, SSO, comes in.
Ah, yes, SSO. Always popular.
Big win for users and security. Sign in once, get into multiple apps, reduces that password fatigue.
Fewer passwords to remember, fewer to get stolen.
Exactly. And simply management overall.
What else does Entra ID manage beyond just logging in?
Application management is huge. Managing cloud apps, obviously, but also on-prem ones through something called application proxy.
Okay, so secure remote access to older internal apps.
Precisely. Plus integration with tons of SaaS apps, a My Apps portal for users, and SSO across the board.
I think I saw something about devices too, not just users and apps.
You did. Device management. Entra ID lets you register and manage devices, often working with Microsoft Intune.
Why manage the device?
Because then you can use device-based conditional access. So access depends not just on who you are, but also if your device is known, secure, compliant.
Okay. Context matters. Now, lots of companies have existing on-prem Active Directory setups. How does that fit with Entra ID?
Great point. They can connect them using a tool called Microsoft Entra Connect.
So they talk to each other.
Yeah, it synchronizes identities, creates a unified experience. So features like SSO and MFA work smoothly whether the app is on-prem or in the cloud. Super important for hybrid environments.
That sounds essential for hybrid setups. Now, what about Microsoft Entra Domain Services? Sounds similar, but different.
It is different. Entra Domain Services gives you managed domain services in the cloud. Think traditional AD stuff like domain join, group policy, LDAP, Kerberos, NTLM authentication.
But without running your own domain controllers in Azure.
Exactly. Microsoft manages the infrastructure, the DCs, patching, backups. You get the services without the operational headache.
So useful for, say, legacy apps needing that old-style authentication, but you don't want to stretch your on-prem AD to the cloud.
That's a prime use case. Or apps doing lots of directory lookups. It integrates with your main Entra ID tenants, so users use their normal logins.
How does it work behind the scenes? Microsoft deploys DCs for you.
Yep. When you set it up, Azure deploys a pair of managed Windows Server domain controllers in your chosen region. Azure handles patching, health monitoring, all that.
Yep.
Important note, sync is one way, from your main Microsoft Entra ID down to Entra domain services. Changes in the managed domain don't sync back up.
And in a hybrid setup.
Entra Connect syncs on-prem AD to Entra ID, and then Entra ID replicates that down to the managed domain services domain.
Okay, that clarifies the directory part. Let's move on to how Azure actually verifies identity, the authentication methods.
Right, and what's interesting here is the constant push and pull between tighter security and making things easy for users, isn't it?
Definitely. The classic security versus convenience trade-off.
Yes.
Passwords being the prime example.
Hassle to manage, not always secure. Which brings us back to single sign-on, SSO.
We touched on that, login once for many apps.
Yes, but the material makes a crucial point. The security of SSO relies entirely on how strong that first authentication is.
Ah, right. If that initial login is weak, SSO doesn't help much. It just gives easier access to more things.
Precisely. So you need to make that initial step robust, which leads us nicely into multi-factor authentication, MFA.
MFA. We hear this term all the time. What's the basic idea?
It's about adding layers, requiring two or more different types of proof of identity, something, like a password or PIN, something you have, like your phone or a security key, and sometimes something you are biometrics, like a fingerprint or face scan.
So even if someone steals my password, the something I know, they still need my phone, the something I have to get that code or prove the login.
Exactly that. Microsoft Entra MFA offers options like a phone call or maybe a notification on the Microsoft Authenticator app.
Makes sense. Now, the dream for many is getting rid of passwords altogether. Passwordless authentication. How does that work?
The goal is to swap the password for something you have, usually a registered device, combined with something you know or are, like a PN or biometric locally on that device.
So first step is registering my device, my phone or laptop, with Azure.
Correct. That creates a trusted link.
Hmm?
Then when you sign in, instead of a password prompt.
I use my PIN or fingerprint on my trusted device.
Exactly. You authenticate locally on the device, which then securely confirms your identity to Azure. No password transmitted.
And Microsoft has specific passwordless options integrated with Entra ID.
Yep. The notes mention three main ones. Windows Amera. Hello for Business is great for Windows PCs. Uses biometrics or a PIN tied to the machine, uses PKI behind the scenes, gives you SSO too.
So my face unlocks my PC and my access.
Pretty much, yeah. Then there's the Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone. Often uses number matching. You see a number on the login screen, tap the same number in the app, then confirm with your face or PIN.
Okay, I've used that. And the third one, FIDO2 security keys.
Right. These are physical hardware keys, often USB style, super resistant to phishing because they use public key cryptography. No shared secret like a password to steal. FIDO2 is an open standard too.
Very secure. Okay, so that covers identities inside our org. What about people outside? Partners, customers, Azure external identities.
Exactly. External identities are anyone outside your organization, individuals, maybe devices, services. Microsoft Entra External ID gives you secure ways to collaborate with them.
So if we work with partners or need customers to log into our apps, this is how Azure handles it.
Yes. And a key idea is bring your own identities. External users don't need a new account you manage.
They use their existing work login.
Yeah.
Or even Google or Facebook.
Right. Their identity provider handles authenticating them, while your Entra ID or Azure AD B2C controls what they can do in your environment.
Like letting a guest into your building with their own ID card, but you control which doors they can open inside.
Great analogy. The sources outline three main capabilities here. First, B2B collaboration business to business. External users sign into your apps using their preferred identity. They usually show up as guest users in your directory.
Okay. And B2B Direct Connect. Slightly different.
Yeah, Direct Connect sets up a mutual trust between two Microsoft Entra organizations. More seamless, especially for things like Teams shared channels. The external user might not even be a guest in your directory, but access is still managed.
Interesting. And the third one, Azure AD Business to Consumer, B2C.
B2C is specifically for your customer-facing apps. If you build an app for consumers, B2C handles their sign-up, sign-in, profile management. separate from your internal partner stuff.
So you'd mix and match these based on who you're collaborating with. Enter B2B sounds really handy for inviting guests, even with social IDs,
It is. And importantly, there's a feature called access reviews for these guests.
to make sure they don't keep access forever if they don't need it.
Exactly. Guests or internal sponsors can periodically review and reapprove or remove access. Entra ID can even suggest who might no longer need access based on inactivity.
That's smart. Keeps things tidy. Okay, we know who can get in and how. Now, controlling what they do once inside. Conditional access.
Precisely. Conditional access is a really powerful Entra ID feature. It's like a smart policy engine. It looks at signals who the user is, where they are, what device they're using.
And then decides what to do based on those signals.
Right. Based on your policies, it decides. Grant access, block access, or maybe require an extra step like MFA.
So it's context-aware security.
Exactly. Huge benefit for admins. Lets users be productive anywhere but protects assets based on risk. And it makes MFA less annoying. Maybe no MFA from the office, but definitely require it from a cafe.
That makes way more sense than just always requiring MFA. What's the process? Signal, decision.
Yep, 3 stages outlined. Signal, gather the context. User, location, device, app. Decision, evaluate policies based on signals. Allow, block, require MFA. Enforcement, carry out the decision.
Can you give some examples? Where would you use this?
Oh, lots of places. Require MFA for admins always. Require MFA for anyone accessing sensitive data from outside the network.
Okay.
Maybe restrict access to company apps to only approved managed devices, or just flat out block logins from risky locations you don't do business in.
Very granular control. Now let's shift to Azure Role-Based Access Control, RBAC. This sounds more about predefined permission sets.
That's it. Managing permissions gets messy fast in the cloud, right?
Right.
Lots of people, lots of resources. RBAC helps by letting you assign roles like reader or contributor to users or groups.
Instead of figuring out permissions for every single resource for every single person.
Exactly. It simplifies things hugely and helps enforce that principle of least privilege. Only give people the access they truly need. Azure has built-in roles, or you can create custom ones.
So if I add a new engineer to the network engineers group, and that group has the network contributor role on a resource group,
They automatically get all the permissions defined in that network contributor role for everything in that resource group. No manual permission tweaking needed for that user.
much more scalable. Where can these roles be applied? What's the scope?
You can apply RBAC at different levels. Broadest is a management group, which holds multiple subscriptions.
Okay.
Then at the subscription level itself, then resource groups within a subscription, and even down to a single resource, like one specific VM or database.
So I can make someone owner of a whole subscription or just reader on one specific virtual network?
Precisely. You pick the scope based on least privilege. Maybe an auditor just needs reader on a specific resource group. An admin might need owners higher up.
And it's hierarchical. Permissions flow down.
Yes. If you assign a role at a higher scope, like a management group, those permissions are inherited by everything underneath it, all the subscriptions, resource groups, resources within.
So owner at the top means owner everywhere below.
Pretty much. And how is it enforced? Through Azure Resource Manager or ARM?
The main Azure management engine.
Right. Every API call, portal click, CLI command goes through ARM.
Yep.
And ARM checks if the user has the required RBAC role for that action on that resource at that scope.
And it's an allow model. Deny by default.
Correct. No explicit permission means no access. If you have multiple roles, your permissions are the sum of all of them.
Important point though. RBAC is for Azure Resource Management, right? Not permissions inside an application or database.
Crucial distinction, yes. RBAC controls who can manage the Azure services. Data level or application level security is separate and needs its own controls.
Got it. Okay, let's switch to a broader security philosophy. Zero trust.
Yeah, zero trust is a big shift in thinking. The core idea. Assume breach. Don't automatically trust anyone or anything just because it's inside your network.
So ditch the old castle and moat idea where inside is safe, outside is dangerous.
Pretty much. That perimeter is blurry now anyway, with remote work, cloud apps, mobile devices. Zero Trust says you need to verify every access request explicitly every time.
Microsoft pushes this model hard, based on
3 core principles, according to the material. First, verify explicitly. Always authenticate and authorize based on all available data points, identity, location, device health, service, data classification.
don't just trust based on one factor.
Right. Second, use least privilege access. Grant just enough access, just in time, JIT, JEA. Use risk-based policies. Protect the data itself.
And the third, Assume breach.
Assume breach. This means minimize the potential damage if someone does get in. Segment access, encrypt everything, use analytics to detect threats quickly and improve defenses.
So no more implicit trust based on network location. Every request is scrutinized.
That's the goal. Authentication and policy enforcement happen regardless of where the request comes from.
Makes sense in today's world. Now, another core strategy. Defense in depth. Layers of security.
Exactly. Multiple layers, so if one fails, others are still there to protect the information. The goal is to slow attackers down, make it harder to reach the sensitive stuff.
Like an onion, maybe?
Perfect analogy. The material lists 7 layers, usually visualized from the outside in or inside out. Data is at the core.
Okay, what are the layers?
Working outwards from data. Application security, compute security, VMs, endpoints, network security, segmentation, firewalls within Azure, perimeter security, DDoS, edge firewalls, identity and access, Entra ID, MFA, RBAC, stuff we've discussed, and finally, physical security for the data centers.
And each layer should ideally work independently.
That's key. If one layer is breached, the others still function. Let's quickly run through them. Physical is obvious, securing the actual buildings and hardware.
Right. Identity and access.
All the secure login, MFA, access control auditing we talked about.
Perimeter.
Stopping large-scale attacks from outside DDoS protection, maybe Azure Firewall at the edge of your network.
Network layer.
Limiting communication between resources inside Azure. Network security groups, segmentation, denying traffic by default,
Compute.
securing the VMs themselves, patching, anti-malware, hardening configurations,
bad.
building security into the apps, secure coding, managing secrets properly.
And finally, data at the core.
Controlling access to the data itself, encryption, access control lists within storage or databases, ensuring confidentiality, integrity, availability.
So multiple hurdles for an attacker.
Exactly. It increases resilience significantly.
Okay, with all these concepts and layers, is there a tool in Azure to help manage and see all this? Microsoft Defender for Cloud?
That's its role. Defender for Cloud is designed as that central hub for security posture management and threat protection, not just for Azure, but also on-prem, hybrid, even other clouds like AWS and GCP.
A single pane of glass for security.
That's the aim. It provides unified management, integrates lots of tools, helps you assess your posture against benchmarks, defends against threats, and has native Azure integration.
And it protects on-prem and multi-cloud too. How?
Through agents like the Log Analytics agent, or increasingly through Azure Arc, which extends Azure management and Defender capabilities to servers and clusters anywhere. It can even do agentless posture management for some non-Azure resources.
What kind of threats does it look for?
A wide range. For Azure services like App Service or SQL, it looks for suspicious activity, vulnerabilities. It does vulnerability assessment for VMs, containers, SQL.
Okay.
For networks, it enables things like just-in-time VM access. For hybrid multi-cloud, it can ingest custom threat intelligence and protect resources in AWS and GCP if you connect them.
The notes mention 3 pillars. Assess, secure, defend. Briefly, what are those?
Assess is about understanding your posture vulnerability scans, integrating with Defender for endpoint. Secure is about hardening, using Azure Security Benchmark for policies, getting recommendations, tracking your secure score.
And defend.
That's the threat protection part, real-time alerts, remediation steps, correlating alerts into incidents, advanced features like JIT access, and adaptive application controls.
So it's a continuous cycle.
Right.
See where you stand, get advice to improve,
Yeah.
and get alerted if something bad happens.
Exactly. And it's designed to scale with your environment. As you add more resources, Defender for Cloud aims to cover them.
Wow, okay. We have definitely taken a significant dive into Azure identity, access, and security today.
We certainly have. Hopefully, listeners have a clearer picture now of how these pieces fit together, from Entra ID as the foundation to Zero Trust as a philosophy, and Defender for Cloud tying things together.
Absolutely. It should give everyone a solid grasp of how Azure approaches protecting resources and data.
And, it's crucial to remember this space is always changing. Cloud security isn't static, so continuous learning is really key.
Good point. Keep these fundamentals in mind as you explore Azure further. And speaking of fundamentals, if you do want to solidify your understanding, especially for the AZ-900 exam.
The book plug.
You know it. Don't forget to check out our book, Mastering Microsoft Azure Fundamentals, AZ-900 Exam Prep. It's available on Amazon, and we'll drop the link in the description. It's packed with info and exercises.
Definitely a helpful resource.
So, as a final thought for our listeners,
Yeah.
what stood out to you as most critical today? What's one thing you might look into based on our chat? Something to ponder as you continue your Azure journey. Thanks for diving up with us.